and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation about books your therapist may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry in Toronto, in Canada. In this episode, we're talking to sex educator and intimacy coach Justine Barre. Justine has over 8 years educating on a wide range of sexuality topics, as well as 20 plus years as a kink practitioner and 10 plus years practicing polyamory. She specializes in kink, BDSM, and polyamory, as well as consent practices and queer sex, and works at The Witches Therapist, a collective of spiritual practitioners. We're talking to Justine about the books The Ethical Slut, 3rd edition, by Janet W. Hardy and Dossie Easton, and On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong.
For 20 years, The Ethical Slut, widely known as the Poly Bible, has dispelled myths and showed curious readers how to maintain a successful polyamorous lifestyle through open communication, emotional honesty, and safer sex practices. The 3rd edition has been revised to include new content addressing non-traditional relationships beyond the polyamorous paradigm of the more than two, while utilizing non-binary gender language and new terms that have come into common usage since the last edition.
On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is a letter from a son to a mother who cannot read. Written when the speaker, Little Dog, is in his late 20s, the letter unearths a family history that began before he was born, a history whose epicenter is rooted in Vietnam, and serves as a doorway into parts of his life his mother has never known, all of it leading to an unforgettable revelation. We loved talking to Justine. It was a really great conversation. We could have kept going for the longest time, and hope that you enjoy and start, I don't know, considering the word slut in a different way.
Welcome, Justine, to Books from Your Therapist.
Yay!
So happy to have you here.
I'm not so happy to be here.
We love to just start with like a little bit of an intro for our listeners.
So my name is Justine Barre, and my pronouns are she, her, and I identify very strongly in a very political outward way as queer, and that definitely informs my practice.
You're a coach and a sex educator.
So I use sex educator and intimacy coach.
Okay. I would love to talk about the term coach because you're our first coach that we've had on, which is great. I think the term coach can be used sort of broadly sometimes and means like different things to different people. And not everyone participates in some of the systems that are like licensing systems. And, you know, I can only speak to the US process of that, but I would be curious, like, what is your education and what are the things that you've studied to kind of influence your work?
I have a ton of education. I just don't have the quote unquote what's right education. So I have an undergrad, I have a 3-year, I have a weird degree from England in psychology that is considered a master's there, but a undergrad here. And that's where I started to really become like a psych nerd, was in England. And then I lived there for 5 years. And then when I moved back, I was like, cool, from that degree in England, I could have gone directly to a PhD. I'm like, I'll just do that here in Canada. And they're like, no, we don't recognize that 3 years of education you did. So that was a huge bummer and a big blow because originally I really wanted to be a sex therapist and like a clinical psychologist. So I had to reroute a little bit. And then I worked in a feminist sex toy store for 5 years as their head of education. So I was working there as like a salesperson, but I was also developing all their workshops and like facilitating most of the workshops. And that was my greatest education for this work. Like that was a level of praxis that you cannot get in school. I mean, you can't learn how to milk a prostate in in grad school. So and then after that, I did a Bachelor of Education. So I have a degree in education itself. And that was quite recent. I finished that in April, and I just need a break. So When I first ended up talking to Maggie, who was my boss at the Witches Therapist, we were talking about how much I wanted to get back into that like one-on-one space with folks to like use my deep level of like knowledge and praxis that I had to like help people, but I don't have that piece of paper that says that I can be a therapist. So we went with coach. And what that means to the practice is that I don't deal with like therapy-y things. If you have sexual trauma, that is not for me. If you have deep-rooted stuff that goes back into like your family, that's not for me either. If things are quite medical, like erectile dysfunction or vaginismus, I tend to like redirect people to like other sources. So I'm dealing more with kind of the present and the future and weaving in that like deep education piece with like helping folks in a more practical, hands-on way. Does that make sense?
Totally. It makes a lot of sense. And I think I know we chatted a little bit before we started recording about how you've been a teacher, and a lot of folks that go into the mental health field have sort of a thread that brings them there, right? Like occasionally I meet someone that works in the space that studied psychology, in undergrad, went to grad school, like just kept on a linear path. But I think for many of us, like myself included, the path is sort of all over the place in a collection of different learnings. I love hearing about it because I'm always curious how people sort of find their place in this work. And it sounds like a collection of things that you're both interested in and passions of yours.
Yeah, like I'm a profound sex nerd, like I always have been. And I mean, that started was back in my undergrad. I did sex work. I was a stripper, and I found the psychology of it fascinating. Like it was one of the best, most interesting jobs I've ever had because I like loved the like puzzle of like, why are people here? How does desire work in this space? Like, what is like real sexuality versus consumable sexuality? Like all of those ideas. And ever since then, it's been like a deep passion of mine. And finally, I kind of gave up on that idea that I had to have the right thing and go to the right place and have the right piece of paper when I have like so much lived experience to offer.
It's cool to hear because as someone that's licensed within my state, I know plenty of really talented clinicians and guides and folks that work in this space that, aren't licensed, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're not talented or trauma informed. Not everyone needs to participate within the system, especially if you allow it to work for you, which it sounds like you're creating your sort of part in all of it, which is really cool to hear.
Thank you.
You kind of walked us through the string that kind of brought you into the work. When you say like psychology nerd and like sex nerd, was there anything that really inspired you to kind of combine those two things into where you are now?
I don't know. I've just always been into it. There wasn't like a one thing starting point. As a teenager, I read erotica for fun, for the like, I've just always been really super into human sexuality. And so as I kind of moved around the world and did all this different stuff, that was like the thread that went through everything. I mean, even in my undergrad, neither of my major or minor were about human sexuality, but all my electives were in queer theory. So, I mean, even then, I was totally obsessed.
I love it. The passion really comes forward. Can you tell us a little bit about who you work with and where you work?
I work with a collective called the Witches Therapist. They're really based in kind of two ideas. One is that there's a spirituality that can underpin the therapeutic practice. So a lot of the therapists use like ritual and tarot and various other forms. And the other is a quite political, anti-oppressive, anti-colonialist ethos that also underpins therapy. So it's the kind of the idea that every one of us works with the knowledge that you can't heal in a broken system.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourself professionally or personally before we dive into your book picks?
No, other than that, my intimacy coaching is new for me. So I'm just building a practice right now, and it's a really exciting journey. Sex education is way more established in my life. Like I'm doing workshops in my community. I doing webinars for other therapists around sex and sexuality, but the things that I specialize in. Oh, I should probably say what those are. In my intimacy coaching, the things I specialize on are kink and BDSM. And I've been in that community for a really, really long time. And I've been teaching about best practices for a really long time. Queer sex and how that can like help. How do I say this? How that can help reframe heterosexual sex in healthier ways, perhaps, and polyamory, which is what we're going to be talking about today.
All right, so let's jump into your first book. I'm really excited. I was excited that this was your book choice because, yes, The Ethical Slut. I was excited because I've read bits and pieces of this throughout the years, but I've never read it cover to cover. So I was like, this is a great reason to. And yeah, so the name of the book is The Ethical Slut, A Practical Guide to Polyamory, Open Relationships, and Other Adventures by Janet W. Hardy and Dossie Easton. And this book was truly groundbreaking when it was first published in 1997 and has like become a key resource for people exploring polyamory, open relationships, and just various forms of consensual, sexual, and romantic arrangements outside of the traditional monogamy. How has this book influenced your work and personal life?
So I first encountered this book when I decided that I wanted to be polyamorous. I was married at the time and quite miserable. I was reading another book actually called Sex at Dawn by Chris Ryan, which is like a basically an investigation into our more like primitive roots as a culture and how we organized ourselves like tribally and how kind of pair-to-pair monogamy wasn't theorized that like pair-to-pair monogamy pairing up in that way wasn't something we did for like millennia and millennia. We lived in these tribal groups where we all had sex with multiple partners and we raised each other's children. And I remember reading that and it just like resonated with me so deeply while I was stuck in this very isolated marriage. I had a young child. We didn't have a lot of outside community. And I just felt like very deeply in my heart that that was wrong. Like that didn't feel correct. So because I'm a nerd, we didn't just open up our relationship. We had to read the entirety of The Ethical Slut chapter by chapter and have weekly check-ins where we each read a chapter and then came together and discussed the chapter together and what it brought up for us. And we did the little activities that are in there, which are great. And we did the whole book before we actually like opened up our relationship, which is still something that I like recommend that people do. So this was about 11 years ago. At the time that it was kind of one of the only resources available for people exploring polyamory or like more creative relationship structures. Now there's tons of books out there. Professionally, I use it as a starting point for most folks because it is quite accessible. There's lots of books on polyamory, but they all vary in their complexity and their intensity and their depth and their focus. And I find that The Ethical Slut just covers like the basics in a really well-written, very straightforward, very easy to understand way. Like I mentioned before, they have these cute little activities you can do. And I think it's just like a really non-threatening way for people to start because people get overwhelmed when they start looking into like, because I mean, basically we're like, just unlearn your internalized monogamy. And everyone's like, oh, okay, I'll just do that.
Right. Check. Easy.
Yeah,
Right.
done. Yeah.
I was very surprised at how accessible the book was as well. I don't know if I thought it was going to be some sort of thesaurus of like terms, but it's really written in a way that is just like really accessible and like thought-provoking and just yeah, there's a lot of takeaways that you can come from it. Like I don't know, I thought it would be more difficult and it really wasn't.
Yeah, like I mean, I would recommend anyone read it. Like you could benefit from it if you consider yourself to be a monogamous person. I also think a lot of the stuff around jealousy and conflict would be very useful for people in any kind of relationship, work relationships, friendships, all sorts of relationships.
I was reading it going, I'm amazed that this was like written and put out in 1997. That feels like such a long time ago in terms of where I don't say where we've come, but like the amount of books and I don't know, education and normalization of some things like since 1997. I feel like we've come a long way. I think we have a long way to go. Like, let me be clear. But I was so amazed that this was written in 1997. Yeah, I kept thinking that. I'm like, these people, I want to meet them. They seem so
Oh my God.
badass. Oh my
I would
gosh.
if I could meet Janet Hardy. She also writes books. Both Janet Hardy and Dossie Easton write very accessible also books about introductions to BDSM. So, I mean, these people are like my heroes. I would love to meet them. I mean, the crazy thing is, I mean, they wrote this in the 90s after like 20 years of experience. So, it just goes to I mean, that was my first takeaway when I read it was like, wow, people have been doing this for like a really long time, like totally under the radar. How come I don't know about it? How come this wasn't presented as an option to me?
Hmm. I think that's such an important piece about it is, we're raised in this sort of heteronormative way that this is like something you really had to seek out versus the messaging of how you're supposed to be. And this monogamous relationship is sort of shoved down our throats since we're born. So yeah, like I said, I was really excited that you chose this book. I know I think there was some conversation about using the book Come Together, but we had already covered that one. So I was like, oh, I'm so pumped that this is the one. I was hoping we could start with some of the language that's used in the book for folks that
Sure.
might be interested or are not familiar with, what is an ethical slut?
So, actually, there's a lot of discourse around this right now.
Hmm.
An ethical slut, this is kind of where the term ethical non-monogamy comes from. And the reason that term was set up as it's ethical slut is it's a way of having multiple partners in your life in a truthful, open, communicative way. You're not lying, you're not hiding, you're not cheating. And before, with people who've experienced monogamy, the only way that you can have sex with another person is to lie to your partner and cheat on them. And that is not ethical. Like, that is a breach of trust. And I think that this was the first thing. I think I've said that about three different things now. I think this is one of the first things that really spoke to me because I'd always had a really hard time being monogamous. I fell in love with multiple people at the same time, was very sexually attracted to lots of different people at the same time. It was always a problem in my relationship. Like, I hurt people and I didn't like it. I didn't like that I hurt people. And when someone offered me a framework where I could operate in the world in this way that really suited the way that I love and experience like sex and relationships, but I could do it in this way that respected my partners, that uplifted them, that we were concerned with each other's well-being at all times and like each other's freedom at all times, wanting the best for the people that you're with, experiencing happiness and compersion when you see them experiencing joy with other people, like all of that. I was like, "Oh my God, yay." Like, I'm so excited that I can go from feeling terrible about myself to actually feeling like really wonderful about myself. And so an ethical slut is somebody who proceeds in all of their relationships with like kind of an ethical roadmap about how to treat people well and with respect.
Do you use the term ethical slut either to identify for yourself or do the people you work with or clients use that as a way to talk about themselves? Because for me, this was like a very specific to this book, right? Like, I'm curious, like if that's a term that you use sort of in your personal or professional life.
It is. I think you're right. Like, it is very connected to this book. And this
Hmm.
book is seen by some to be quite outdated now, but I definitely resonate with the term slut. Like, that is a term that I use and that a lot of the people close to me in my community use. It's always resonated with me as someone. I kind of liked it in a defiant way, as it like was a word that was used as a slur against me when I was younger and that I got to reclaim as I was older.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people have that experience with it.
I think Tara and I talked a little bit about it. It's like they use the term slut a lot in the book. So for me, it was interesting to just notice what comes up for me, like somatically and internally when I hear that, right? And I know Tara, yeah, you and I talked a little bit about it, like, wow, this is like it's interesting to hear this over and over in the book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what I find is interesting about it as well is that it sort of like slut sometimes can, it has the negative connotation of like multiples or many, but at essence of this book is really like putting yourself first and your sexuality being kind of like what you're comfortable with. So I kind of liked that juxtaposition of like the slut being like something you're really just kind of like being core to like what is, making you happy in whatever kind of scenario that you're in. Um,
Yeah, it takes the shame out of the word. Like it
right.
takes the shame
Yeah.
out of wanting to have lots of sex. Like there's nothing wrong with wanting to have lots of sex and lots of people and have sex with lots of people. Like there's absolutely like if we take the morality away from that, if we take our weird internalized like religious upbringings and all of that stuff and like weird shame we put on women specifically to be like pure and virgin, all that stuff. We take all of that away. A slut is just a person who likes to have sex. There's nothing wrong with that.
You sort of spoke to ethical non-monogamy in sort of the last question, but I'm curious for maybe folks that don't know what polyamory is. Can you define what that is?
I can try. I mean, like all movements, there's like a real fractured,
Right.
like, people identify with different terms. There's many, many ways to be non-monogamous. Oh, I don't think I finished that thought. People are taking the ethical away from non-monogamy now because the word non-monogamy is assuming an ethical framework. I just wanted to say that.
Hmm.
So yeah, there's many, many ways of experiencing and practicing non-monogamy. And that's everything from like you and your married partner of 20 years go to a sex club once a year. That's practicing non-monogamy. Practicing non-monogamy is you're in a throuple. Practicing non-monogamy is you live alone and you have multiple partners. Practicing non-monogamy is a whole bunch of things. So people who define themselves as polyamorous, it can kind of come from two places. One is, and this is an also, so there's discourse around this, but one of the ways is that some people use it as an identity. Like I am in my core a polyamorous person, and I actually resonate with that personally. And some people use it as a way of practicing relationships. So generally, when people call themselves polyamorous, it means that they are open to or have multiple relationships that are open to love and sex in their lives. That's really like as broad as I can make it because everyone has kind of their own individualized definition.
Sure. I think you did a beautiful job trying
Thank
to.
you.
So, moving to the sex educator part of your work, and they touch on this in the book. As a sex educator, what sorts of myths or misinformation about sex do you see a lot?
Oh God. I mean, what don't I see? We're so broken as a society when it comes to sex. We're so criminally underinformed. We are so desperately just trying to figure it all out alone or with our partner, just the two of you against the world and your genitals. Like, it's so tough. And I really learned this when I was working at the sex toy store, which was like people came in and they couldn't even, I mean, I would have a series of kind of like yes, no questions I would greet people with. Are we looking for this or this? Do you want this or this? And I could tell that most people had never said out loud what they wanted. Like it was so difficult for them to be like, I want a vibrator. We're so, I mean, I want to use the word like crippled by shame and silence when it comes to sex. That's why the work I do feels so political to me. Like I really consider myself a pleasure activist because I really see the benefit it has in people's lives. Okay, so here's a great example. I had someone come to me recently, was like, I've been really freaking out. Can I just, this was just a friend. This was not in my practice. This was like really freaking out. I've been crying and laughing after sex. I don't know what's going on with me. I've looked it up on the internet. Reddit's all weird. Like I don't know what's going on. And I was like, "Oh, I do that too." And they were like, "What?" They were like, "I thought it was weird and I thought I wasn't normal." And I was like, "Oh no, I like cry after sex constantly." It's like I actually kind of look forward to it when it happens. And that's the thing, there's just silence. Like there's just silence. There's no normalization. But if you had to twist my arm and I had to pick one thing, it would be pleasure. Sex is supposed to be about pleasure. It's not about orgasms. It's about pleasure. Those two things are different, right? And under that, connection. And that doesn't matter what kind of sex you're having. You could have met someone at a nightclub and you go home with them at 2 a.m, but you two are connecting, and that is what you're seeking. You think you're seeking an orgasm, but what you actually are seeking is connection. I really wish I could teach people, specifically women or AFAB folks, that you deserve pleasure. You should be experiencing pleasure at almost all times, and that your partner, your pleasure should be your part, like in the forefront of your partner's mind. I'm about to go teach sex ed at my kids' school. I'm going to drop that little bomb on those grade sevens because I wish someone had told me.
I am so fascinated by that. I'm like, yes, I want to like, okay. So on that note of like going to teach sex education, what do you think is missing in like the curriculum or just general discourse about sex for youth trying to learn about what it is and how to do it and how to do it safely?
I wish you could have seen, like, if this is, you're listening to this in the audio medium of the podcast, the like profound, like, eye roll I just did. I mean, everything is missing. What isn't
Yeah.
missing? Like, what isn't missing? I mean, it drives me crazy that they even split boys and girls up. Like, what? What? Like, what? You're a boy, and most of you are probably going to have relationships with women your whole life, and you're not supposed to know about the menstrual cycle. Like, it's all cuckoo bananas.
In my school, because I grew up in like Ireland in the 90s, early 2000s, they separated the boys. This is in high school as well. When they separated us, we didn't really get sex ed, but they put black bin bags on the windows for fear any boys might peek in to again learn
And
about the
like
menstrual cycle.
see an ovary.
I know.
Like, see a picture of an ovary. Yeah, I know. It's crazy. I mean, I was doing my Bachelor of Education, so I was in school, so I got to see it firsthand. And I it's one of the reasons I did not choose to go into teaching in the public school. I was like, I'm way too radical for this. Like, I can't, there's no way that I can like remain confined to these very narrow perimeters of what they think is acceptable to teach these children about their bodies.
I love that you're too radical for it. And the phrase pleasure activist is a great one. I'm glad that you brought that forward. In the chapter on sex and pleasure in the book, the authors say, "We do hope this book supports you in grasping your sexuality in any way that works for you. Remembering whatever the physical possibilities the body you or your friend inhabits, the most important sexual organ is always found between the ears." Can you speak to this?
Yeah. There's two parts to that I really like. The first is that sex is just between you and the person or people you are having sex with, and whatever is consensual and feels good for that you and those people is okay. It's so simple. It's so simple to say. Doesn't matter what's normal. Doesn't matter what other people do. None of that matters. None of it matters. It's between you and another person. I mean, I've been in the kink community for a really long time, so people are into some freaky stuff. And that's okay. None of that is wrong. None of it is, I mean, it's what two people decide to do together. So if you can just take all your shoulds and is it normal? Am I crazy? Is it bad? Is it embarrassing to ask for like all of that like chatter in there and get rid of all of it and be like, I really want to be slapped in the face. And you know what? That's okay. I'm gonna ask my partner, are they comfortable with it? They are? Cool. Then you guys are doing something that is great. You're fine. You're totally okay. So that's the first part of that that really speaks to me. And the second part of that is about how sex is very, very neurological. And I don't think we have time to get into like the science of that. And you've already talked about Emily Nagoski on this podcast. So they are the premier source for that kind of information. But I mean, mostly you're dealing in neurochemicals and your nervous system. Like those are the two things that are activated and are kind of fueling how you feel, how if you feel desirous, if you feel shut down. Those things are not very generally have very little to do with your genitals. Your genitals are just responding to what your brain is feeling. There's a lot going around on the internet about this term responsive desire. And this is the concept that a lot of folks, specifically women, mostly more, actually need a lot of like build up and context in order to feel desire. So the idea of someone like, you having a long day at work and then coming home and feeding the kids and doing the homework and like doing the laundry and then getting into bed, and then your partner rolls over cold and is like, hey, you want to have sex right now? And the answer is no. But if your partner has been sending you sexy texts all week and bought you a new sex toy, and then you came home and they had made dinner and put the laundry in and changed the sheets on the bed, like that context and preparation is what allows that soothing of the nervous system to happen and makes room for desire to grow. And so that's actually been like quite a revolutionary concept for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I'm so happy that you brought it up because we did talk about this when we did one of the Emily Nagoski books, but I feel like it's a message that needs to be talked about over and over, right? Because we a lot of times think that we're supposed to have this like spontaneous sort of desire that or response to any sort of like stimulation or any time someone's like coming to us for connection and pleasure, right? And this has really normalized that, yeah, we have these erotic floor plans that we need to kind of be in the right space, and you can explore what that is, right? And it's totally okay to not have a spontaneous moment with your partner. Maybe you need more warming up or time or space to get into that room of pleasure or desire, right? So I'm like, yes, like I feel like anytime we talk about sex, I hope we can
These are my
continue.
floor plan cards.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect.
But
Yes,
I mean,
like
that's a great point. And like,
yeah.
spontaneous desire is, I'm not going to call it a myth, but it's not what people think it is. I mean, some people do. Some people are just really horny and like you can turn over and be like, you want to have sex? And they're like, yeah. But most people compare where their relationship ends up in a longer term relationship with where it was at the beginning. And they're like, I want to go back to that because that was spontaneous. But that's actually not true at all. If you're dating somebody and you see each other on Thursday night and it was hot, and then your next date is on Tuesday, all you're going to do between Thursday and Tuesday is think about sex. And then to get ready for your date, you're going to shave your legs, you're going to have a shower, you're going to do your hair, you're going to wear your matching like bra and underwear. All of that is like priming your brain for sex. And so you are doing that like contextual work. And maybe they're sexting you, maybe you're sending each other nudes, like all of that is priming. And then when you get there, it's like you erupt like a flame, like it happens. That's because both of you have been like priming each other and yourselves for sex for like days and days and days and days. So it feels really automatic, but actually a lot of work has been put in to get you to that space.
I like that you added that in, right? Because I think a lot of us learn about sex from movies or media and we see these scenes, right, that are just unrealistic, and we take the messaging away of I'm supposed to have this really big response automatically, and that's just it's unrealistic and really unfair to put that sort of pressure on yourself.
Yeah. I mean, every movie is like passionate fumbling for 45 seconds and then immediate penetration. And I mean, watch out for it. It's crazy. It's every sex scene in every kind of movie. And it's for economy of time, I think, for it and like as a storyteller. But I'm always like, she's not ready. Like, Like, stop. Don't just shove it in there. Yeah, it's crazy. And then that's true. People, and we're not getting sex education in school, so that's the sex we're seeing is in movies and TV, and that's how we think it should be. Yeah, it's bad.
And it's primarily like monogamous sex as
Oh yeah.
well in like movies and TV and any sorts of like media, just in our culture in general. Do you have advice for somebody that's interested in exploring a different type of relationship structure? I'm sure you're going to say like number one is to read this book, but
Yeah.
what advice do you have for anyone that's kind of interested in kind of going outside of monogamy?
My advice to take it really slow and to do your research. Now, I get everyone's not like nerdy, but if you decide to have any form of non-monogamy, you are going against everything you have been conditioned in every possible way. And you're correct. Every movie, every TV show, your parents, your school, people asking you in kindergarten if you have a boyfriend, if you're a girl, and if you have a girlfriend, if you're a boy, like you're going against everything. So that takes years and years and years to unlearn those norms and values, things like possessiveness, things like jealousy. There's all sorts of different ways that non-monogamous people deal with those things differently. I suggest reading this book, reading other books, listening to an audio book if that's better for you, and go to workshops. Go to your local sex toy store and see what the resources they have. That would be my first suggestion.
I think you mentioned jealousy really brief because I wrote down one of the quotes from the book, what I thought was really kind of apt. It said, like it or not, the only person that can make jealousy hurt less or go away is you. And I was like, that's like obviously profound, but it's just something about like reading it, you're kind of like, yes, they've hit the nail on the head there.
Yeah, do we have time for me to speak on that? Because it's one of the
Sure.
hugest ways that people have to like recalibrate when they do non-monogamy. And it's the first thing monogamous people ask you about. It was like, is don't you get jealous? And they ask you in this way where it's like, oh my God, like how do you even deal? In monogamous relationships, we give jealousy a lot of power. And it's usually power over your partner. So your partner does something, for example, they flirt with somebody at a bar and you see them and it gives you a bad feeling. And so you go home and you have a fight about it. And you say, I had this really bad feeling. So you can never, ever make me feel that feeling again. So what you did was really bad and you can never do it again because I can't ever have this feeling again. And then the person's like, okay, I'm sorry. And then, they don't do it again or they do it again or whatever. In non-monogamy, jealousy happens also all the time. It's very normal and natural to feel jealousy. Jealousy is one of our emotions that we feel. But in non-monogamy, we don't give it any more or less power than any other emotion. And very specifically, you don't have any power over your partner. So if they're going on a date with somebody and you're feeling like, like I'm feeling quite jealous and like a little insecure about that tonight, they should still go on that date. Like you don't get to stop them. Your jealousy doesn't like control their behavior. However, you do have a responsibility together to like work together to soothe bad feelings. It's like, okay, I'm going to go on this date, but when I come home, I'm going to bring you Ben and Jerry's and we'll talk about everything you're feeling. Can I order you some Uber Eats while I'm gone? Like we care for each other. Like you're not supposed to like be cold and distant. You're very there to help support the person through those bad feelings, but those bad feelings don't exercise any control. The other piece to that is that jealousy is one of those like top emotions. And generally, what is underneath that jealousy is all other things. Like, I'm insecure that you're going to like her more than me. Or I'm feeling really stressed with the kids and you're just leaving to go on a date. Or I am a different body type than this person and that makes me feel a certain kind of way. So, also, non-monogamy asks us to interrogate our jealousy and to identify what that underpinning thing is and then work on it. The thing about non-monogamy that monogamy doesn't ask us to do, but non-monogamy does, is to really like do some work on ourselves. And they say this in this book, which is jealousy is a teacher. It's going to show you where your like little niggly ugly parts are inside that feel bad, but it also gives you an opportunity to work on those, which is like, oh, okay, I'm dealing with some serious body insecurities. Like maybe it's time I get a therapist and like talk about that with somebody. Jealousy is always your teacher. So it's a really quite radical, different way of dealing with that emotion in non-monogamy.
I am loving this thread because for me, there's like a dance in any sort of relationship form of togetherness versus like individual, like your piece of it, right? And so for me, the word like self-responsibility comes up a lot around this of like, it's not your partner's responsibility to fix your emotion. Like to your point,
Exactly.
like there is a coming together and a soothing because you care about that person and you don't want them to be feeling a certain way, but it's not your responsibility to fix the jealousy. That is that person's self-responsibility to get curious, right? Like to your
Hmm.
point, to dig in and say, what is underneath this for me? Like maybe there's a deeper childhood story for me that is influencing this feeling, right?
Hmm.
So yeah, like that feels like important to talk about. So I love that, like your piece about how in monogamous relationships, sure, jealousy comes up, but it it seems a little bit like in non-monogamy sort of situations, to your point, you're forced into digging into that, whereas some people can coast in monogamous relationships forever without investigating it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's why I think like the going back to like the term slut, like that's I think it's just such a like it really is putting yourself and like doing that work on yourself first,
Yes.
kind of, and like
Yeah. The people I find who are best at, okay, and that's controversial because it's like there's no good, right, wrong way of doing non-monogamy, but I'm gonna put it this way. The people who seem most comfortable in non-monogamy operate with a profound level of curiosity about themselves and about their partners. And that kind of willingness to do that reflective work is goes a long way in non-monogamy.
and this book has a chapter for single people that are interested in like polyamory. And it kind of can be thought of as sometimes like, or anything like non-monogamous kind of assumes there's a relationship. But what do you think single people can take away from reading this book?
Oh my God, so much. So actually, I loved that you two added this question because this is actually the chapter I think is the most outdated. What they describe in this book as being single, quote unquote, we call it solo polyamory, meaning that you don't have a nesting partner or a primary partner, meaning you don't live with somebody, you're not married, you don't have like a partner that is like your first biggest, most intense relationship, the person maybe you have kids with, the person that you are financially entangled with, all of those things. It means usually you live on your own and you date and have relationships, but no one's moving in with you. Your space is sacred, and your level of like entanglement is regulated in a way that makes you comfortable. There's a term we use in polyamory called the relationship escalator, which is this idea. This is also deep monogamous conditioning, which is that relationships have like various steps towards like increased commitment. So it's like you start dating and then you have sex and then you become exclusive and then you move in together and then you get married and then you have children and then you die together. And another part of kind of unlearning a lot of that monogamous conditioning is kind of unlearning the relationship escalator. So I consider myself to be solo poly and also a relationship anarchist, which is I can get into that in a minute. I live alone in this beautiful apartment. I will not give up for any single person. And I am a single mom. So for right now in my life, I don't want another person like raising my kid with me. I don't want someone else in my house interfering with my shit. Like, I don't want it. And so my relationships happen outside of that level of kind of escalation and commitment. Like, there's no escalator. We're not going anywhere. So we have to find ways to feel committed to each other that don't involve constantly moving that relationship forward to these like landmarks that you have to achieve. So my current partner, we've been together 4.5 years, and we always say lovingly, looking into each other's eyes, I will never marry you. I mean, we may be together forever, who knows? But I will never get married to this person. So that's solo poly. Relationship anarchy is also a fairly new term. It's a pushback against this idea of hierarchies in polyamory. A lot of couples, when they open up, they do a lot of safeguarding around their primary relationship, usually out of fear. So usually out of fear that like if someone else comes in, it's going to like destabilize or affect the like security of this relationship that they already have. So they say that their nesting partner is their primary partner. And that, depending on the couple, comes with a whole bunch of different weird rules and safeguards and sometimes veto power, meaning like your partner can like veto one of your relationships if they feel threatened by it. And then your other partners are like, you're my secondary partner, you're my tertiary partner. Lots of people practice polyamory this way. I personally find this deeply unethical. Like for me, this goes against ethical polyamory in the way that if you're a secondary partner, you're not being treated as like a full human being with full like needs and desires and respect, right? Like if I'm dating someone and their wife can phone them in the middle of my date and be like, I don't feel comfortable right now, you have to come home, and they have to leave. That's not for me. That's not like respecting my time and my autonomy.
So I think we've covered a lot of this book, and I feel like we could keep talking about this for forever. How has this book inspired you?
Polyamory inspires me. I wish everyone knew they had the ability to create any kind of relationship they wanted. There are no rules. The rules are made up. All the rules are made up. Again, I'm never going to marry you. Like, don't, just don't do it. Like make the relationship you want. I have a friend of mine, a really close friend of mine, who's thinking about they're married and moving separately, like living separate, like moving out. They already live together, moving back out to separate apartments. They want to stay married, but they're like, maybe we can love each other better that way when we have our own spaces and we're excited to see each other because we miss each other a little bit. And I'm like, yes, that's a great idea. Be creative. There's no right, that's not wrong to do. That doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything is bad or going wrong with you. It means that you're finding creative solutions that work best for the two of you. So it's back to that piece where it's like between you and the other person, no one can tell you what's right except for the two of you.
I was going to say, I feel like this book is so permission giving,
Yeah.
right? Like I keep going back to imagining someone reading this in like 1999 when we didn't have the internet and we didn't have more books like this out there. Like I'm just like, this book is so world shifting for folks, and
Yeah.
like, wow, I've had these feelings. I just keep coming back to like, this is so permission giving for people that are curious. And yeah, so I just so appreciate that this is the book that you chose.
I'm so happy to talk about it.
Well, let's move on to the second book, which is the book of your choosing, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. Why did you pick this book?
I used to be a voracious reader of fiction, and podcasts have totally like superseded that in my brain found an even easier way to escape. But it's one of the only fiction books I've read recently, and it like shattered me. It felt like a gut punch. It was so achingly beautiful.
Truly, it's something that definitely stays with you as you're reading. And I was also glad you picked it because I had added it to my list and kept meaning to get around to it, but hadn't. So you gave me the little kind of nudge to read it. So I appreciate that. It's really layered and poetic, and it explores many different themes like the immigrant experience, queer identity and love, generational trauma and healing, and like the power of storytelling. Can
Mhm.
you speak to one of them that stood out to you the most?
All of those layers are so intertwined. It's so hard to kind of extract one piece. I'm always interested in the queer experience, small town, rural. all those scenes at the tobacco farm, you know. I also found it interesting that the queerness in this book, it's not as like I almost felt like that wasn't what the book was about. It was about survival. Like it was about this boy and all his friends like trying to survive. My sister, who is an absolute icon of a human being, works with marginalized populations around drug use. So she's a nurse and she works at needle exchanges and at safe consumption sites. Through her, I've become very interested also in like the opioid crisis and like what that looks like for so many communities. So I found that look at it too, that kind of deep personal look at the opioid crisis, like really affecting too.
You've sort of led us there, but I feel like we can't talk about this book without talking about like this idea of intersectionality, which is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and, talks about how various aspects of a person's identity, such as race, class, gender, sexuality, intersect and influence their experience of privilege or oppression. Can you speak a little about the importance of intersectionality and how it applies to our protagonist, which is Little Dog?
This book explores one identity, which is this main character, and we have to address his class. So he is poor. We have to address his sexual identity, which he is queer. We have to address his immigrant status and that what that means to his otherness, the trauma that comes from the like you said, the intergenerational trauma, having immigrant parents who had no access to resources, who experienced war and are kind of quite mentally ill surrounding that, just about marginalization on a whole bunch of different levels. And what I thought was really beautiful about this book is that they seamlessly entwined all those things in this one person's experience. And for me, that's like almost a universal experience. We are all layers and layers of identities that are all informing us. And I think it's really important as like practitioners too to recognize that, right? That at any given time, all these things are at play when people are talking about their feelings and their emotions and their difficulties in life.
And this book really blurs the line between fiction and nonfiction because it's like classified as literary fiction. The author states it's not a memoir, but it does read like a literary telling of the author's life. What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I like loved that. I didn't care what was real and what wasn't real. For me, Little Dog was real. Like what the author actually experienced or didn't experience became so unimportant to me. But the realness of that character, they were just so like tenderly drawn by the author that yeah, like I just felt like it didn't matter. Like I didn't care.
Yes, that's the sign of like a really good writer as well, of like being
Hmm.
able to, yeah, like you're saying, it doesn't really matter. I do wonder if it gives you like a little bit more creative freedom. It's an interesting sort of like it's right on the border between both kind of classifications.
Hmm. Hmm.
Who would you say this book is for? Like
Oh,
I mean, I know it's a big question, but I'm curious, like when I say that, you're like, oh, this person or these people should read this book.
that's tough.
Yeah.
Because the book is tough. Like
Yes.
I've actually because I've recommended it to certain people in my life, but this is a book that I give some trigger warnings to. I mean, whatever of those marginalized identities that you've had experience with, like this book will be tough, like tough to live because it's so beautifully written. So you live inside those experiences, and those experiences are traumatizing, like really,
Hmm.
really intensely difficult. And it's like the juxtaposition between like the poetic prose and like beauty of the prose and the beauty of the writing with these very kind of stark empty landscapes and spaces and
Hmm.
emotional landscapes. So I think that this would be an enlightening read for anyone. You want to know more about what it's like to be queer? Read this book. You want to know what it's like to be an immigrant or a child of immigrants? Read this book. If you want to know more about what it is to live through the opioid crisis, like read this book, but guard your heart.
It reminded me of, I don't know if you've read A Little Life, but it had like that sort
Oh,
of like grabbing book,
yes.
but also like devastating. Like,
Devastating. Oh God, A Little Life is one of my favorite books. I've read it several times, but
Mm.
every time I read it, I'm like, oh, like why? Why am I doing this to myself? It's just too beautiful.
I know my colleague was reading it and once had to get off a bus 2 stops early because he was like sobbing.
Sobbing. Yeah, I know. Again, the writing, I mean, the writing is so good.
Yeah, you mentioned it. I feel like achy is the perfect term. I think I've said that multiple times. I know you mentioned it, but I'm like, it felt achy reading this book.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess, you touched on it a little bit, but I'm curious if there are any like triggers about the book that you feel like folks should be aware of if they decide to pick this up. There's a lot of trauma, so I feel like we don't need to make a
Yeah.
laundry list, but I'd be curious, like anything that's stood out for you, that might be like important to mention.
Oh God. I mean, I think I kind of rambled, like listed a bunch of them, like parental abuse, mental illness,
Hmm.
poverty, like extreme poverty and the trauma of extreme poverty, drug use. Like if you have any trauma around seeing people do drugs, if you have like that kind of like traumatic drug use in your own past, like if you were bullied for being queer, like any of those could be this could book could be intense for you for sure.
I would also like add on to it any sort of like PTSD or generational PTSD from
Yes.
veterans or
Hmm.
any folks that have been impacted by this one, is specifically to the Vietnam War, but any sort of war and PTSD, I think is something to be aware of too.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
like racism in general and like any
Oh,
kind of
yeah.
struggles with language too, right?
Oh
This,
God, yeah. Yeah.
So what inspires you about this book?
My original undergrad was in creative writing with a specialty in poetry. So for me, it's the artistry of this book that I find inspiring. Being able to tackle like we've this laundry list of like very intense topics so with such delicacy and beauty. That was for me, that tension between those two things was what I was like, like this book is delicious to me. I find that really inspiring. I find the ability to make beauty out of things that are hard and ugly. I find that very inspiring.
and it's like so short a book that like every word is so kind of
Hmm.
delicately, deliberately chosen.
Yeah, this also had been on my list to read. So just like your first book, I was like, yes, I've been meaning to dig into this one. So I was super grateful that you brought this one in. Anything else about this book or anything else in general?
No, I mean, I don't know what else to say other than like open your heart, let it in.
Hmm.
So beautiful. It's worth it.
For folks that might be listening and are curious about your work, where can people find you online? And, when you work, are you working in person or online? Just curious about anyone that would want to connect with you.
I work for a collective called the Witches Therapist. So if you want to book with me, it's at www.thewitchestherapist. And it's witch with an S, not an ES. Like it's the witch possessive, not the multiple witches. Do you know what I mean? So thewitchestherapist.com. I'm currently working virtually, so people from anywhere can access my services. I am just starting baby steps to have an online presence. I just joined Blue Sky, so I'm Justine Sex Ed on Blue Sky. I am Mix Eve XO on Instagram, and that's as far as I've gotten so far. I'm about to start a Fet Life account. If you don't know what that is, then you're not kinky. So to start a FetLife account and get on TikTok eventually, but I've got to like wrap my head around starting to make content. But for right now, yeah, thewitchestherapist.com is where you can book me.
Well, you're natural, so can't wait to see more of your content.
Ooh.
Totally.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations or are a mental health practitioner interested in coming on to share, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Happy questioning if you want to jump on that relationship escalator.
Happy pleasure activism.